What's up everybody? So in this video we're going to be comparing every single faction that resides in the Warhammer 40k universe. I'm going to give you that certainty, clarification, and also if you're looking for some inspiration on maybe your next army or your first ever army, then keep watching. Intro. So guys, welcome to Vanguard Tactics. I'm Stephen Box, and it is my mission to help you become a better 40k player. Now, I've not only worked on myself to become a better player, but I've also helped hundreds of other people to reach their potential in this game. And we're going to be using some of those techniques to analyze all of these 40k factions to see which one comes up trumps. But that's not it, and if you stay until the very end of this video, then I have a little giveaway for you, and we're going to be giving away a get started box of your choice. So the details to how to enter that competition are going to be at the end of this video, so stay tuned. Now, before we start, I better make a few things clear. Most of the armies or factions in the 40k universe can actually be played in a multiple or different amount of ways. However, I need to take a very sort of critical and competitive viewpoint on these armies, and that is what we're going to do. So we're going to look at them through that lens along with their core nature as a faction, what I think is also really thematic. Now, that doesn't mean that you can tweak and change things to suit you, and absolutely you want to build and tailor an army the way you want to do it. Now, I've broken down these factions in their ability to perform in the movement phase, the psychic phase, shooting, melee phase, and also their durability. So we're going to look at 5 points to compare all these factions. And I've given it a rating from either 1 to 5, keeping it nice and simple, from very little being a 1, 5 the most of, okay? That's our kind of barometer to find out where these things land, which means the larger surface area over the next few diagrams that I show you are going to be a little bit more forgiving. Arguably, you could say that they are the easier factions to use and also play with. I'm also going to be going over their play style and also how easy that faction is to get to the tabletop. So let's get started. So, it'd be rude not to. Let's start with the Space Marines, the icon of Warhammer 40k, the protectors of mankind. So these boys, and I've clumped these all together, are packing a very strong punch. You can see from the radar, these guys are around a 3 for their movement, 3 for their psychic, 4 for their shooting potential, 3 for melee, and also 4 for their durability. Now, the Space Marine chapters, and also have now got their individual codexes, are actually very, very diverse, and each of these could be manipulated by 1 or 2 points here or there. But as an overall, that's probably where they stand. In terms of their play style, these guys are an absolute toolbox. You can kit these guys out in any way that you really want to. You could go a lot more melee focused, you could go a lot more combat, you could go for a little bit more resilience. So you can really play these guys in such a way that is able to handle any situation on the tabletop, which is probably why they're one of the strongest factions out there at the moment. In terms of their hobby aspects, these guys come in most of the starter boxes, and also not only that are they quite easy to collect and pick up. A lot of the kits are either very minimal multi-part, either quick easy fits, or actually the fits of all the models are very simple in terms of just bolting on arms to a model or torso, and also the larger flat surface areas make these guys very, very easy to paint. And I would probably say these guys are one of the easiest armies to take to the tabletop very quickly. So there we have it, the Space Marines. So up next we have the ADEPTUS SORORITAS, or commonly known as the Sisters of Battle. So let's have a little look at how these guys are doing. They've got a 3 for movement, a 1 for psychic ability, as they have little to none apart from a few ways to deny. They also have a good amount of shooting. However, I personally don't really feel like that's where they excel, and actually good Sisters army that's tailored more towards the melee phase is going to really get a lot more out of that Sisters army. They've got good durability, but I wouldn't say it's exceptional, and I wouldn't say it's terrible either, so they're sitting in that mid-range. And really, the Sisters of Battle are trying to win the game in turns 2 and 3 by moving up the board turn 1, using their durability to stay alive, and really dominating turns 2 and 3, and then hanging on as their numbers whittle away during the later stages of the game. So really, this is kind of like an Alpha Strike early game type of army. But in terms of their hobby, not only do you need a large model count for the Sisters, for the Adeptus Sororitas, but also the models, because of their intricate ways of the armor and also the robes, they can be quite difficult to put together and also paint, although the kits look absolutely stunning, and obviously you want to do those justice. And I would personally have these guys or ladies as one of the hardest armies to get to the table. But on the whole, a very melee based army, and also one that certainly punches above its weight. So next up, the Astra Militarum, or commonly known as the Imperial Guard. So let's have a little quick look at how these guys shape up. So in terms of movement, they have some aspects of good movement, but typically they are much lower than a lot of the other factions. So we're putting them around a 2 here, but 2 to 3 is probably where these guys sit. Psychic phase, they've got a couple of good psychers with some key powers, which is important, so another 2, but really they're going to excel in this next phase, which is the shooting phase. These guys is where they really come into their own, whether it's certainly at range, not needing line of sight, and also having packing the punch where needed in that phase, with a little bit of melee support from a couple of key units, and their durability is pretty moderate. Now, in terms of their play style, what they're trying to do is sit back and shoot as much as they possibly can. Then later on in the game, they're going to be moving out to grab those objectives and control the board with using their key infantry units, whether it's scions from reserves, using move, and actually using the mobility of their army at that point in the later game for turns 4, 5 and 6. So this is a late game winning style playlist. In terms of getting this army to the tabletop, it's pretty moderate. The armies, the kits themselves, so the models are quite easy to build, they're quite easy to paint, but just the sheer volume that you have to do for Imperial Guardsmen and also the tanks makes this a little bit more difficult than maybe something like the Space Marines, so we've put them at a more moderate amount in terms of getting them to the table. But overall, a very skilled tactician with this army can do exceptionally well with it. So up next we have the Adeptus Mechanicus, or commonly known as the AdMech. Now these guys are a very shooty army. We're going to delve into some of their stats now. So movement wise, currently at the moment with their model range, they have very limited models in terms of that can actually move quickly across the board and hold that ground quite well. So unfortunately these guys are one of the slowest armies out there, and that also represents their play style as well, with most of their models being infantry based, whether it's destroyers, robots and such likes. So these guys have got a 1 for their movement, no psychic ability at all, so they're also looking at a 1 for their psychic. But in this next phase is where they absolutely dominate, and that is a 5 for their shooting. Just the quality of shots, the good ballistic skill, the ability to shoot indirectly at range with good minuses, great damage, puts these guys, punching harder than most other factions out there, along with some of the stratagems that these guys have got. So if you're looking for a very shooty army, then the AdMech is going to be one for you to certainly look at. Now they're slightly weaker in the combat phase with only a 2, and also again medium durability. However, this does, I need to say this now, this doesn't include an Imperial Knight. We're going to look at those separately, but including a Knight into your AdMech would actually boost up their melee and also maneuverability ever so slightly, because they have great movement in combat. So adding in those units will just take that up a notch to maybe have a nice little counter punch or forward shield pressure unit from that knight. Again, very much like the Imperial Guard, these guys want to sit turns 1 to 3 and try and shoot as much as they possibly can off the table before they then move out and win the game in terms of grabbing the objectives, holding the boards, turns 4, 5, 6, maybe even 7. So again, these guys, in terms of their playstyle, if you're looking for one where target priority, threat ranges are something that you want to excel at in the game, then certainly look at AdMech. The model range is fantastic, very, very detailed miniatures, and also some really good, nice ways to paint the Dark Millennium. So up next we are going to look at the Imperial Knights. Now I am thinking of this as a pure Imperial Knight faction where you're looking at 3 to 4 huge knights on the table. Now these guys were certainly very, very dominant for a while in the meta, but let's have a little look at their stats. So for movement, they are looking at around a 3 with some, all of their knights being very fast moving. However, the lack of models just means that overall they can't cover as much ground as some of the other factions. 1 for their psychic potential, just because they have no way of actually casting any psychic powers. 3 for their shooting ability. Again, they've got some really good weaponry, but also some of their other weapons, just because of the amount of models that other armies will be packing compared to them, their shooting ability is quality. However, they don't get particularly many rerolls or buffs, so yeah, it's a good level of shooting, I would say, and that goes the same for their combat. So again, a sort of good to moderate amount of melee, but their durability is a 5, and the reason for that is all of the knights will have an invulnerable save. You can take that up to something that's also very reliable at a 4+. Then along with combining an entire army's worth of toughness 8 with 3 up or 2 up saves, with 6 up feel no pains, with knights that are able to stand back up again, and also having a knight specific army. When you push that army to the extreme range, that means your opponent has to have enough firepower or ability to get rid of a knight every single turn, and often, unless somebody's built for that, then they may struggle, which is why the knight army is known as a gatekeeper list. For those armies that can deal with it, then actually the knights won't be very durable at all, but typically across the board then they are very, very durable because of their toughness 8 and 24 wounds per model. Now, these guys, they are very much what you would classify as a kill denial list. It's going to be very, very difficult for you to get multiple kills off this army, as there's only literally 4 to 5 models in this army. Now, they will be trying to get the kill more every turn if they're playing in an ITC event, and also they're going to deny you from getting those kills, which is the object of their mission, to be able to wipe all the units off your army that is any sort of threat to them, and then they are free to roam around killing and picking up whatever they need to, because they full well know that whatever you have left won't be able to kill them. So very much kill denial, and then they can react as needed to your game plan. But in terms of getting them to the table, as I said, there's only a few models. The kits are quite easy to build, and with some techniques like dry brushing and some washes, you can get these guys on the tabletop very, very quickly, looking fantastic, especially if you have something like an airbrush or using some contrast paints on some of the bigger panels. You're going to get these guys to that tabletop very, very quickly, which is why I think we saw such a big explosion in terms of the popularity of knights, because it's very easy to get them to the table and you can do very, very well with them. Just quickly, what I want to know is if you are kind of keeping pace with me so far. If so, just comment below with a yes. So up next, we're going to take a look at the Custodes, the boys in gold, the Emperor's Bodyguard. Now, these guys sit in a very unique position at the moment, with most of their real high damage firepower being something that is accessible through Forge World models. However, in terms of their codex, that's really where we're going to be taking a look in terms of their stat line. So when we look at their stats, They are a much slower moving army, unless you went for a pure bike army, in which you're only going to have 2 or 3 units, which yes, they are quick, but again, the lack of amount of units means that their general maneuverability to control the board is actually slower than some other armies. So yeah, we're going to put them at a 2 for their movement. Now, in terms of their psychic ability, it's a 1 because they have very minimal amounts of psychic. They've just got a small amount of defense. Shooting, as at a 2, yes, they can put out a lot of shots from those hurricane bolters that are on those custody bikes, and some of the units do have some nice shooting ability, but as I mentioned, some of their higher ranged firepower, which would probably push them into a 3 category, is actually in the Forge World codexes. So if you want to include some of that, then certainly you can take up your shooting option a little bit more with those units. But melee is where these guys excel, with every model being extremely hard to take down in combat, and also every single model having good AP, a good number of attacks, and literally every single one of these guys is as good as any sort of Space Marine captain by themselves, equipped with some fantastic weaponry. So melee is where these guys are going to do most of their damage. In terms of durability, these guys are quite difficult to kill. They've got good armor saves and vulnerable saves, and also with multi-wounds per model, with a lot using the infantry keyword, and in one army that really used terrain quite well, blocking line of sights, using cover, would actually find their army being very durable if they use very large units as well. So similar to the Imperial Knights, this army specialises in kill denial, not getting killed, and picking up as many of your units as possible, whilst really focusing on the units that are going to do these guys damage, which is going to be any weapon with a high AP value. Lots of shots they can take as long as it's got minimal AP, and because of their high toughness, you are going to have a hard time getting rid of these models, and any unit you do put in combat with them, if you don't kill them, they're going to kill you back. So again, their durability is quite good. But in terms of their hobby, again, they've got some really nice miniatures, and also the way that their colour scheme works with building the actual model itself, and the spray paints you can use to get them to a quick tabletop standard, puts them as one of the easier categories to get to the table, along with their smaller model count. So up next we've got the Grey Knights, and if we take a look at their stats, then their ability to move is mainly based on their ability to deep strike, redeploy using psychic powers, or using some of the key units like Inceptors that can jump across the battlefield. So they have exceptional movement during that, but when they are then down, their movement becomes quite minimal. So we're kind of looking at a moderate to high level of movement, so putting it around a 4. However, the phase that these guys absolutely excel in is the psychic phase, especially with the new edition of Psychic Awakening, where they're able to do most of their damage through smites and mortal wounds. So yes, their shooting phase may lack slightly, only a 2, and they do have a couple of units that can shoot quite well, but again, it's a limited amount compared to some of the other factions that are out there. But when you combine the shooting and the psychic powers together, then actually their ranged ability is rather potent. But very much like the Custodes, they're gonna excel in melee, so this is where they're gonna have all of their weapons coming to bear, where they're good -3 D3 damage on most of their weapons, with good amounts of attacks from things like paladins that also can fight when they die. Really puts these guys in the category of wanting to excel in, like I said, the psychic phase and also the combat phase. With good saves, puts them at around a 3 in terms of their ability to be killed, so I'd say moderate. Do have good armor saves, however they can lack invulnerable saves, especially from ranged attacks, so that is where they can struggle, with only 1 wound on their single troop units, unless they're going for things like Terminators, but without too many or too much use of some of the larger vehicles that may be slightly more durable. So they're around a moderate in terms of their durability. But the Grey Knights are an exceptional army, very fun to play, and also where they really come into their own is very much in terms of being able to alpha strike their opponent using some key big units, and if you like the lore around these guys, then these are certainly going to be an army that you should definitely check out, because they certainly have that rule of cool. But in terms of their hobby, probably one of the easiest armies to get to the table. You're looking at anywhere from around 40 to 60 models, and also with that, again, very quick and easy to do with sprays, contrast paints and washes. So very easy with the metallics there to get them to the table, looking great. So up next, my personal favourite, the Blood Angels. Now, the Blood Angels have exceptional movement from the jump pack unit, so putting them at about a 4. Now, they do have some psychic powers that are useful and can be tapped into if you do like that. So they have a little bit of psychic, which, you know, can be utilised quite well in some situations with things like the Librarian Dreadnought or Mephiston. But again, you're only looking from one psychic tree and only a couple of really useful powers in that book. Now, the phase that they kind of skip over, in my opinion, is the shooting phase. Yes, there you can actually take a huge array of shooting. They just don't excel there, because things like your Super Doctrine will be only in the Assault Doctrine at turn 3 onwards, and a lot of the characters give melee focused support rather than shooting support. So you kind of want to leave the shooting to one side and really focus on what you're good at in the theme of having a chainsword, and that is the melee phase. And there's not many armies that can really go toe to toe with these guys, which puts them at a very, very high potential potency for their combat ability, very much like the Sisters of Battle or some other factions that we're going to focus on shortly. But in terms of durability, again, like the Grey Knights, kind of hit that medium amount. They do have some good units with good saves, like the Sanguinary Guard, but the lack of invulnerable save can really be quite challenging for them. And an army with a good amount of AP to their weaponry is going to go through the Sanguinary Guard or other key units like the Death Company, which the Blood Angels really, really rely on. But the Blood Angels are an absolute alpha strike list. They have got great potential to hurt you turn 1 with turn 1 charges, and really trying to win the games from turn 2 and 3, really, where they start to excel when they get to that Assault Doctrine, and then again wrapping and trapping to hold out and do as much as they possibly can in terms of controlling the board, but obviously can be played in a very cagey way as well, just like most of these other armies. But yeah, really we're looking for an alpha strike kind of with the Blood Angels, and if they're going to get the opportunity, they're probably going to take it. But in terms of their hobby, again, quite easy to get to the table with, you know, a reasonable amount of models, easy kits to build, easy kits to paint. So yeah, slightly like easy to kind of more moderate in terms of getting these guys to the table, just like the Space Marines are. Up next, the Deathwatch. These guys are the Xenos killers, and a real kind of toolbox army, and even more so than some of the other factions that are out there. But the Deathwatch, in terms of their ability, they've got great movement through their use of the Teleportarium, which is like a deep strike. So they do have good movement, with a lot of their main infantry squads containing bikers and also Vanguard vets, so the army can be quite fast paced with moving. And also then they have a little bit of psychic powers, just like the Blood Angels, with one, you know, maybe Psyker included in a faction or in an army build, with a couple of key powers like Null Zone. Shooting, these guys can really excel with things like the huge weight of volume of shots, which is where they come into their own, especially against Horde builds, and then with the use of their special ammunition, where again they can wound most things on 2s, and also get rerolls against specific things. So they're very, very reactive. They've got good durability in terms of their invulnerable saves from Storm Shields, Terminator Armor, Primaris Marines, with 6-up Feel No Pains from Warlord traits and stuff, but also they can react to most situations in the game. They're looking to see where their opponent's gone, come in nearby, kill it, trap it, wrap it, and then also then focus on bouncing onto the next one. So they're kind of striking where the enemy is weak and striking where they know they can win their fights, and make sure that they don't get overwhelmed by numbers. So in terms of the Deathwatch, getting them to the table, Actually, they've got some really nice kits, and the Get Started box is fantastic. I would definitely recommend buying multiple buys of the Get Started box, as you get your veteran squads there, or then as soon as you throw in a couple of other boxes, you're going to be pretty good to go. The only thing with the veterans, and the only more difficult part about them, is the really good optimal build is to have lots of storm shields, but mainly storm bolters, and this is where you can have a slight problem with modelling. You know, it is a case of scrounging as many storm bolters as you possibly can of other Space Marine kits, trying to get them off friends, or trying to do some conversions. Now that is the most challenging part of them, which kind of puts them at a more moderate amount, and also painting black can be quite difficult to a good standard, so they're certainly more moderate to hard in terms of the skill level that's needed to get these guys looking great. Along with every single model being from a different faction means that you've got lots of different colours that you need to be able to get good with, so that you can really do this army justice. So, the Space Wolves. Now, these guys play very similar to the Blood Angels, being exceptional in combat. They've got good movement, but not quite as good as the Blood Angels. But they do have, just the same sort of level in terms of shooting capacity. But like I said, all the buffs and abilities really are kind of geared towards the melee phase, and with units like Wolfen, Thunderwolf Cavalry, these guys absolutely excel in the combat phase and are very much hard to get rid of, especially with character dreadnoughts that also can punch extremely hard. So yeah, these guys are one of the best in terms of the combat, and they have decent level of durability with toughness 5 cavalry or storm shields in double wound Wolfen with feel no pains. They actually can be probably a more durable army than the Blood Angels, but in terms of their play style, very much like I said, the Blood Angels, they're an Alpha Strike army, and they kind of play similar to the Sisters of Battle, where they're moving up the table, using cover, as they don't get move blocked, then moving out, and then sort of dominating the table that turns to 2, 3 and 4, scoring most of the points there and kind of winning the game in those turns, and then holding on as best as they can for the later turns. Now the army, very much like the Blood Angels, quite easy to get to the table, mainly being Marine based models, and also quite a good model count. So the Dark Angels, very much like the kind of Blood Angel counterpart, where the Blood Angels excel in the melee phase, the Dark Angels are really going to excel in the shooting phase with the weapons of the Dark Age and making lots of use of plasma weapons. Now they've got good maneuverability from bikes, Deathwing Knights as well, which are basically deep striking Terminators that can come in from quite close away from the enemy, but again with a couple of psychic powers that are going to do you quite well, and then really exceptional, really being exceptional in that shooting phase, and trying to lay down majority of their enemy in those phases, like I said, for those plasma weapons. And then they've got still good amounts of combat ability with the Raven Wing bikes and also the Terminators, so they do have a good potential there, and they've got very good durability, from Feel No Pains on the Terminators to Azrael's 4+ invulnerable save bubble, so they do have a good moderate amount of durability there, especially with the Intercessors with double wounds as your core troop choice. But these guys are going to try and hit you hard very quickly. Again, very much Alpha Strike, trying to win the game in turn 1 to 3 and then hold on for the rest of the game. But getting these guys to the table should be fairly easy. Probably the bikes are a slightly more complex kit to build and paint, but everything else from the Intercessors to the Terminators, again like Space Marines, are quite easy to get hold of and also quite easy to get to the tabletop with simple uses of paint, contrast, dry brushing techniques, and you're going to be pretty good to go. So up next, we're going to take a look at the CRAFTWORLD ELDAR. Now, there isn't an army that I can think of that, for me, the aesthetic of this army is absolutely fantastic, especially with the huge variety of aspect warriors. where these guys really excel, which we haven't really focused on too much, is the movement phase. These guys are one of the best in terms of their ability to get around the board with lots of different units at lots of different times, from flying tanks to flying units themselves, or actual flyers. So their also ability to deep strike, use the webway, just makes these pointy-eared space elves extremely mobile, and also absolutely excel in the psychic phase with all of their psychic powers, and they've got 2 or 3 psychic trees that they can actually draw their powers from to really buff up the rest of the army, so then they can still dominate in the shooting phase as well. Now the Eldar do have a good couple of combat options, from things like Wraith Blades with axes in also their shields, and they have good units in terms of their Shining Spears in Seer Council. However, they are kind of few and far between, and where this army is really let down is its durability, with minimal invulnerable saves on most of those units, only on a couple, with only, majority of the army is toughness 3. So really these guys are, do suffer with their durability. So they are what known as a glass cannon, where they hit extremely hard, but also as soon as they take a hit, they start to crumble. So they're a very, very finesse army to use, and they don't really give you much room for error if you're out of position and you're looking at your line of sight. So if that's an army that sounds like something that you're going to really enjoy and is going to help you get to that next level, then certainly look at Eldar, because they are exceptional at what they do, but also can be hit very, very hard. So really the Eldar are very much a counter-strike army. They can hit quite hard if needed, and what the counter-strike reactive list tries to do is look at how their opponent is playing, and then you try and play off that. So if you're given an opportunity, you're probably going to take it, and also you're going to work your way around in making sure that you're picking fights where you can win them, because otherwise your army is literally going to crumble. But in terms of getting these guys to the tabletop, pretty medium. The kits are nice to build and quite simple to build, with some of the more key concepts like the grav tanks in grav vehicles. Very, very easy to build and paint with smooth lines, and also some of the smaller models like the Guardians in Dire Avengers could be quite easy to paint with things like contrast paints. But yeah, because of the good amount of volume, whether it's of actual mechanical vehicles or models, kind of puts them to like the easier to more moderate level. So up next, Drukhari, or commonly known as the Dark Eldar, the slightly more evil versions of the CRAFTWORLD Eldar. Again, great maneuverability, but probably not quite as good as the Eldar, and they have 0 psychic support whatsoever. They don't quite hit as hard in the shooting phase as they do compared to the Eldar counterpart, because they quite simply don't have the variety of weapons along with the psychic powers to support the shooting phase, but they really do hit much, much harder in the combat phase with core troops like witches and things like Talos and grotesques. Can do incredible damage in the combat phase, along with being a lot more durable. Even like huge blobs of witches in combat have a 4+ invulnerable save, with the 6+ feel no pains across the board from the power of pain. And then also things like grotesques in Talos, which are very, very tough to take down because of invulnerable saves, multi-wound, high toughness. So and a lot more durable, also with all of their vehicles also gaining an invulnerable save from ranged attacks. So yeah, they can be a glass cannon in certain situations, but typically are a lot more durable than their Eldar counterparts. But again, playstyle very much like the Eldar, counter-strike, very reactive, looking where your opponent's going and using key units like Talos and Grotesques to steer the battle, try and force and bait your opponent into doing certain things, while the rest of the army capitalizes on and wins those fights where it needs to, while it lets its own bully units go into the midfield and do what they need to. But in terms of painting, large amount of models to paint, loads of different styles and techniques needed to make these Drakari look fantastic. But the kits are fairly simple to build, but looking at more like a moderate to hard in terms of skill level needed to get these guys to the table. So up next, the Harlequins, and this is probably, I do love the Blood Angels, but Harlequins are certainly up there as well. These guys are one of the fastest armies around, with haywire jet bikes, moving twice, very quick vehicles, troop units that can jump over terrain as if it's not there, with good maneuverability, advancing and charging. These guys are some of the quickest that is out there, with all of their units being able to do so. And actually the Harlequins kind of break every single rule in the game, which makes them really, really unique. But with that, you kind of like live and die by your sword, and you really dance on the edge of death at all times with the Harlequins, as you see later on that they have pretty much zero durability. They do get a 4+ invulnerable save, but any sort of weight of shots is going to destroy these guys. So yes, their movement's great, and they've got some good psychic powers that they really do rely on to make this army tick. Their shooting is okay from haywire cannons, but that's about it, which is only really good against vehicles, not really much else. But these guys hit extremely hard in combat. They're not very durable, but again can be really, really rewarding as a player to know that you have to absolutely master your faction to do well with it, and are extremely difficult to yield, but can be very, very rewarding. And that also means that, as I said, that because they're not very durable, when you do get key moves off in the game, you really show off your skill, which is fantastic with this kind of army. But again, very reactive, Counter-Strike based unit. You pick fights you know you're going to win. You don't pick too many fights because you don't want to get overwhelmed, and it's all about sort of surgically removing parts of your enemy, scoring points where you can, and ultimately being able to attack and defend at different times in the game. But in terms of hobby, these guys, not only is there actually quite a large model count if you go for the bikes, and also lots of infantry, which is a really, really good way to play these guys, but the level of skill needed to paint these guys is exceptional, and really are an absolute painter's dream, I would say. So if you're a real hobbyist and you want to test the skill for your gaming and also your hobby, then definitely look at the Harlequins, and you will not be you're not going to be let down or disappointed with what this army can bring you. So the Genestealer cult, or commonly known as the GSC, they've got some pretty good movement in terms of, you know, most of their army being able to redeploy, coming in from reserve. They've got some very quick units like bikes, and also Genestealers that can advance in charge. But they also really suffer like Harlequins do, in terms of they are a large model count army and a lot more than the Harlequins, but do not get an invulnerable save pretty much across the board, and are very, very easy to kill, with the exception of one unit, which is the Aberrants, which you may see 1 to even maybe 3 of these units in. But these guys have some really good psychic powers that, you know, the Genestealer cult player really wants to make use of. And also they do have some level of shooting, but it's not really where they specialize, because it's in combat where these guys punch, you know, way above their weight in terms of their rock saws, on the Acolyte hybrids with lots of attacks, hitting and wounding on 2s, with high strength, good minus, double damage, and also those Aberrants as well that hit extremely hard. So the melee phase is really where these guys excel. They don't really have much durability, and these guys are really trying to win the game as an Alpha Strike army, kind of in the turns, like early game, turns 2 and 3, and then trying to hold on as best as they can with any lead that they manage to score. But in terms of getting these guys to the table, they are extremely hard. You need to get lots of rock saws to make this army competitive. You need lots of boxes, and the box sets of Acolytes only come in 5, so you do need a fair amount of that. And because of the sort of difference in terms of their limbs and their armor and their cloth and their skin tone, makes these guys very, very difficult to get to the table, and certainly one of the most hardest armies. The Tyranids, which are sort of your friends of the Genestealer cult, so to speak. Again, great movement with advancing charging units, with some very, very fast-paced monsters. Maybe not quite as fast as the Genestealer cult, but pretty much there or thereabouts. And these guys, again, very similar sort of reliance on psychic powers and do very well there, can do lots of mortal wounds in the psychic phase. And also these guys shoot much harder than the Genestealer cult do, with double shooting Hive Guard that can fire indirectly, with Exocrines that can really put out a good amount of damage from range, thanks to the Psychic Awakening, and large squads of warriors that can put out a good volume of shots. But they don't quite hit quite as hard in combat. However, these guys are even probably less durable, with their units being very, very easy to kill. The only thing that really gives them sort of any level of durability is actually their, large model count. And, obviously you can improve that slightly with more Genestealers that do get an invulnerable save. You could go very monster heavy, which does make this army more durable, but again, we're just looking for a sort of ballpark figure. This army that we haven't really covered just yet, in terms of their playstyle, is more focusing on board control. So they're using lots of their models to zone out the board, grab objectives, and basically deny your opponent from moving where they want to, whether that's a fear of being shot at indirectly as they come closer in range, or a fear of combat, which these guys can do really, really well at. So it's kind of a real board control based army, where they're trying to control the tempo of the game, score points throughout it, and also do really, really well on holding objectives. But then in terms of painting and hobby side, well, you do have lots of models, but actually building them and painting them can be very, very simple, with because of the skins in the type of flesh that these models have, a contrast paint could do really, really well, or an airbrush. But yeah, so they're very, very easy to paint. However, and again, like with all of these armies, you can take that to the real extreme and spend absolutely hours on them. But with the volume of amount of models that you need to kind of have, really puts this at sort of a medium range, I would say, in terms of getting them to the table. Necrons, where do they stand? And this one might be slightly controversial, and I would love your thoughts on this, so comment below with what you think. By the way, if any of these that you disagree with, please comment below, and I would love to know why. And as I mentioned before, having a different opinion, this is completely cool. This is just my opinion that I'm kind of sharing with you, with what I'm kind of thinking when I'm building lists, and also going into games in terms of trying to predict their playstyle, and what I'm trying to have in my army, so that I can hopefully build a list that can counter most of these options. So the Necrons typically have, I would say, okay movement, and there are some builds that can make this army quite quicker. However, although they can be quite fast with units like Wraiths and Destroyers, because of the minimal amount of units you're actually going to get for your points, puts them at a slightly slower pace, with all of their infantry being very, very slow. But these guys do not have a psychic phase. Literally, it's like a phase they skip, so very, very minimal there. But they can absolutely excel in the shooting phase, with a small amount of punch. Things like Wraiths that can be okay in combat. But durability is another place where these guys should really, really shine. And yeah, again, for somebody that really wants to play the late game, this is an army for you, where you're going to kind of move forward progressively, be kind of like that wall of sort of silent death as it sort of travels across the board, and you're going to score majority of your points later on. And if your opponent is not very sort of clued up in terms of finishing units, or doesn't have the firepower to finish units, then obviously these Necrons are just going to keep coming back, and their army's going to keep growing again. So that can be extremely problematic. And if you haven't faced Necrons before, then you're probably going to get unstuck the first time you face them. But in terms of their or in terms of the skill level needed to get these guys to the table, it's fairly simple. When you look at the models, they're quite easy to build from their plastic kits, and a couple of quick rattle cans in some washes can get these guys looking all right, and you know, you could even take that to the next level with a dry brush. So very, very simple army to get to the tabletop and look pretty good as well. Okay, so it wouldn't be a proper review if we didn't cover this faction, the Mighty Orcs. And as you know, the 40k universe wouldn't be the same without these guys. So the Orcs, great movement from a couple of units with the jump, so probably, you know, it's kind of, I would say, in the mid-range in terms of their movement. Some good amount of psychic support from a couple of powers that really, you know, the Orcs can have some really, really unique powers like the jump, and also their ability to stack on modifiers from the boys around them, so they have very reliable psychic powers, although sometimes that can end up killing your own models. They've got some really good shooting units like the tank busters and also looters, and the dreaded shock attack gun, which has caused me many a nightmares in the past. And again, good level of combat as well. But one of the areas that these guys do fall down is their durability. Okay, they do have lots of models, but unfortunately they are only wearing a t-shirt. And with majority of the army being toughness 4, then they are quite easy to kill. So not particularly durable. And this army is very much trying to win the game in terms of its board control, with pressure units very much like the Tyrannids do as well. Swamp the board, move forward, put pressures on in terms of combat charges, because you really don't want to be charged by these guys. So yeah, it's really trying to control the board and score as many points as it possibly can, even if it doesn't absolutely, you know, destroy your opponent in table. But in terms of getting these guys to the table, the kits are easy to build, they're actually quite easy to paint, but the sheer volume of them makes them quite very, very challenging and difficult to get to the tabletop, especially if you start going down the route of like custom conversions. It can be one of the hardest armies to certainly get there looking great. So up next, another Xenos race is the Tau. These are very different in terms of what we've looked at before, and very, very unique in terms of their play style, but actually one of the most potent armies out there at the moment. So these guys kind of we see in two typical builds. So you've got one build that is a little bit slower with broadsides, and another build being a lot quicker with riptides. And we're probably going to see another one with Farsight Enclave. So I've kind of put them in that sort of mid-tier in moderate amount of movability because of the swings in which way the competitive army builds go, and that actually shows how good this faction is when you can actually play it in a range of different ways. Psychic phase, they don't have one, they just kind of skip it, but where they do have, which is kind of similar to a psychic phase, is their marker lights, which again use and buff up their units to be more potent in shooting, which again is where these guys are absolutely exceptional. Whether it's Overwatch or also the shooting phase, these guys are going to do all of their damage in the or with ranged weapons, and they have literally zero combat ability. So we saw some really good shooting from armies like the ADMEC, but they still have a bit of a combat punch, whereas these guys do not. Their combat punch is only their ability to overwatch, and with the sort of reliance on the fly keyword to make sure they're getting out of key wraps and traps so they can continue to shoot. But again, like we've seen with other armies, these guys are a late game winner. They'll do as much damage as they can to their opponent early game, but they won't really control the board till late game. So that's really where they're going to come into their own, or they're just going to table you because of the sheer amount of volume of firepower, especially if you're playing on literally a planet bowling ball and you're not using the terrain very well, or you haven't built your army with some very good durability. So yeah, they can really come unstuck against some armies that control the mid board, that are very, very durable, that are always sort of threatening with that combat punch. But a very good army, I think, to play if you're very sort of analytical and you really like things like math hammer and threat ranges and being very, very precise with your movement, then this army certainly could be one for you. But in terms of their getting this army to the table, again quite moderate. Some of the kits are slightly easier to build, some are a little bit more challenging. You've got some really big nice models from the Riptides that are quite easy to build in paint, with some of the Fire Warriors again being a little bit more fiddly potentially because they're smaller, but again with some simple paints in, you know, contrast, bringing out the armor, and the sort of flesh tones can be quite simple. So again, it's kind of puts them at that sort of more moderate amount in terms of getting them there. So we're going to start to look at the Chaos side of things, as we haven't spoke about those yet. Let's start off with the Chaos Space Marines. Now, just like their Marine counterpart, these guys have a very sort of similar amount of movement. They do have some units that can move twice from psychic powers, and that's really where, you know, the psychic phase is something that Chaos really utilize well, and every good psychic or Chaos army wants to have a good amount of psychic support. They work very similar in terms of how Eldar work, using their powers to really buff up their units, whether it's to buff up the shooting phase or the combat phase. Now, they do have some good shooting, and they probably don't hit quite as hard as the Space Marines do, but where they kind of excel a little bit more is with their combat, with things like the Possessed, called Berserkers and Terminators, being a lot more punchy, along with you know, a lot of their characters being things like Demon Princes, and some of their big Demon Engines being incredible in combat as well. So probably punch a little bit harder in combat, less in shooting, but maybe aren't quite as durable as the Space Marines either, because unfortunately they don't get those Primaris models with the double wounds. Most things are single wound. So yeah, maybe not quite as durable, and they're sort of looking to get their durability similar to the Eldar through minuses to hit, and when you certainly don't get those psychic powers off, or maybe you go second and you don't have a chance to cast those psychic powers, then yeah, your army isn't as durable. But these guys can play in a sort of very sort of different amounts of ways. You can alpha strike if you've got the opportunity to, or you could play, you know, very cagey, so very toolboxy like the Space Marines are as well. And then also in terms of getting these guys to the tabletop, fairly simple. That, you know, there's lots of Chaos bodies about that you can, kits you can get hold of, but because of the spiky little bits and extra trims, does make this army a little bit harder to get to the table than their Marine counterpart. So the evil version, some would say, of the Imperial Knights, and we've got the Chaos Knights. So again, very, very similar movement, and these guys can actually move a little bit better, but probably not quite enough to sort of bump them up a category, with some of their abilities being able to add on in stack movement modifiers to these units. But again, don't have a psychic phase, and these guys pretty much shoot the same as Imperial Knights, probably with the only added benefit that these guys can select which weapons they take on each arm, which is a little bit more, you know, like efficient, should we say, but typically the weapons are still working out to do the same amount of damage. But these guys are really much harder hitting in combat, with again a lot of different ways to get and add benefits to their combat, but they're not as durable as the Imperial counterparts, getting the ability to stand back up and feel no pain. So yeah, these guys certainly hit harder, but they can't take the hit quite as well. But again, like the Imperial, you know, when you do have an army-wide model that is toughness 8, 24 wounds and a 2-up or 3-up save, it can be, you know, fairly durable still, and you're still trying to deny those kills because you've only got about 5 models. So it is a kill denial list, and again, like the Imperial Knights, they are fairly easy to get to the tabletop. The only difference is you've got a few spikes that you need to paint and a few different trims, but apart from that, again, with some simple sprays, washes, this army can look pretty good in no time at all. So the Chaos Demons. Now, on the whole, we're probably looking at one particular build, and that's mainly using Plague Bearers with a little bit of smattering of this and that. So yeah, the army's pretty slow, but it does excel in the psychic phase with a huge amount of casters coming from some of their units and also their HQ options. So yeah, psychic phase is really where these guys are going to do all of their punch, and also with minimal shooting, maybe only one unit that's any kind of, and that's only okay at it, so it's pretty much one of the lowest spectrums in terms of their shooting capacity. and then also having an okay amount of combat. It doesn't really excel in combat, but it also isn't terrible, so it really kind of sits in that mid-range, but is a very, very durable army. Now the reason why it's durable, because it stacks minuses to hit with feel no pains, and everything has an invulnerable save. So yeah, durability is certainly where this army excels, along with having a massive amount of models that you kind of put on the table, so it's very, very difficult for your army to for your opponent to get through. And very similar to orcs and the Tyranids, this army excels in kind of board denial, can often be quite a good way to soup some of this stuff together to zone out the board and that kind of thing. But again, with the army, you've got a lot of models, but they are fairly easy kits to build and paint, so kind of puts them at more like a moderate, skill level needed to get these guys to the table. So if you want some really quirky ways to, build and paint your models in a playstyle that really dominates the psychic phase, then certainly look at the Chaos Demons. So up next, we've got the Death Guard. Now we saw these come out with a huge new model range when 8th edition was Dawn, it brought out, and these guys, similar to what I just mentioned with the Chaos Demons, very, very slow, and they have good psychic support with okay and moderate shooting with okay and moderate combat, but durability is really, really where these guys kind of excel with high toughness values. But currently at the moment they're still waiting their Psychic Awakening book, and hopefully with that will just make these guys a little bit more potent, because I think they can sometimes be a little bit lackluster, especially with poor mobility and slow moving units. They're just not able to score the points that are needed to win the game that easily, so it can be very, very difficult army to do well with. But that being said, again, very much in terms of like kill denial list, where it's going to be very difficult to shift some of these units, and they are really going to try and slowly cover the board, just like, for example, Necrons do. So they're kind of sitting that kill denial and late game winners. And also with their kits, they're fairly easy to build and paint, with some of them being push fit and some of the models being quite larger to easy paint with contrast paints and stuff. Then again, these guys are fairly easy to get to the tabletop. And the last faction to review are the Thousand Sons. Now these guys are very, very slow infantry based list, but because of the trickery that these guys have with redeploying units, with putting things in deep strike, with being able to move and start 9 inches away from your opponent, these guys have actually got pretty good mobility because of that. But when they are down, then they are quite slow. But again, like the Grey Knights, which is their kind of counterpart, I would say, these guys absolutely smash it in the psychic phase, and there isn't many armies that can actually go toe-to-toe with them in terms of their psychic output, with multiple trees to pick from. And again, you could either go for smite spam or mortal wound spam, or what you can do is buff up your other units to really make them shine. Their units are reasonably durable with their rubric means, with ability to modify AP weapons and their Scarab Occult Terminators, which have got a great armor save themselves. But again, their shooting is okay, it's not exceptional. Their combat is probably not quite as good as some of the other factions like Chaos Space Marines with things like the Possessed, but are still okay. But again, durability pretty good from using modifiers, good invuln saves to boost that durability. But on the whole, very, very fun army to use in terms of its trickery, fantastic paint scheme, and this army, like many others of the Chaos nature, are going to try and control the board using pressure units like Zangors to wrap and trap units to keep them in their own deployment zone, while the rest of the army moves up and mortal wounds everything off the table. And then in terms of their painting and hobby required, well, like I said, the colours are exceptional, and it really does take to get all that blue and yellow looking really sharp and nice, slightly harder, but the kits are fairly easy to build. But yeah, just kind of put them at more like a moderate but high level needed to make these guys look incredible. So there we have it, guys. That is the review of all the factions. Which one do you think came out trumps? Comment below. I'd love to know what you think. To be into a chance to win that Get Started box, all you need to do to enter is comment below, I want a Get Started box. Then if you comment below with that, I'll take all the names that mentioned that and I will do a prize draw on the last day of May. And hopefully by then coronavirus will be over, shops will be open and I can get that lucky winner the contents of that Get Started box. And I'll announce that over on the YouTube community thread along with in my email box. So if you signed up for any of the courses, gifts, cheat sheets, anything like that, then you're going to know who that is and you can claim your prize. So I really hoped you enjoyed this video. If you did, remember to please give it a like and subscribe and share it with somebody that might be starting a new army that's wondering what they should collect. Or maybe you've got that friend that's always jumping between armies and they can never really stick with one. Show them this video and hopefully it will give them some clarity. Now, as you may have noticed, I didn't tell you which one I thought was best because I think in the right hands, any of these armies can be extremely competitive and you can do very, very well with them. Okay, and like I said before, you can chop and change the list slightly to, go up a few points higher or a few points lower, and you can basically play any of these factions in a multiple amount of different ways. Some of them don't have those options, but often most of them, you do have some sort of versatility with them to take them in a direction you want. So I'll see you guys on another video. Take care.